So this panel is titled SquareSoft, the Weird, Surprising Early History. Press a button. Okay, great. Okay. So, just to recap who I am for a second, in the year 2020, right when the pandemic hit, I finished up what turned out to have been a 24-year career in the media, from On America magazine, if you remember that one, to Wired magazine, and everywhere in between. And along the way, I wrote a few books, one of which was called Power Up, How Japanese Video Games Gave the World an Extra Life, which was published back in 2004, and there's a new edition that came out in 2016 with some new material. And in 2017, I wrote the book Final Fantasy V for Boss Fight Books. Good news, both of those available here at the show. If you come and find me, I'll tell you where at the end of the panel. So I said that in 2020 I had left the media, and that was because I had this incredible opportunity to go and join my friends at Digital Eclipse and to start telling the history of video games, not via books, not via blogs, but via an actual video game itself. So now, as editorial director at Digital Eclipse, I head up all of our research and writing efforts and design the museums and the interactive timelines and the other ways that we experience the history of games within these collections, within these games themselves. So far, I've worked on Blizzard Arcade Collection, Space Jam: A New Legacy, the game, writing jokes for Bugs Bunny and LeBron James was a weird, unexpected career highlight. Disney Classic Games Collection, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Cowabunga Collection, and coming very, very soon, playable here at the show, is Atari 50, the anniversary celebration. But I still write books, and just a couple of weeks ago, we announced my latest one, and that is really why I'm here today, talking about SquareSoft. So I'm writing a book, tentatively titled A Collector's Guide to SquareSoft 1983 to 1996. It is to be published by Press Run, and Press Run is the new book imprint of limited run games. No, it is not limited. The book is not limited. No, it is not just a physical book. It will be available continuously, and there will be a digital, ebook version as well. And that's the case for all the books that are coming out through Press Run. That's why they rebranded, essentially. But it's a book about Square history, but it's a book about the games, and it's a book about collecting physical objects. This is something I think a lot of the sort of game history books that are sort of like here's an overview of the system's catalog, or here's an overview of this publisher. What I think a lot of them miss is discussion of the actual physical objects themselves and what those tell us about how these games were played, how they were experienced, how they were purchased, how they were interacted with, and so that's kind of what I want to do. So I have been collecting SquareSoft games since, I guess, technically 1993. Here's what my SquareSoft collection looked like in 1993. That is how, I did not do that. That is how that looked when I got it from my middle school friend Dennis, who wrote his name on the cover and drew an extra sword on there. I have since upgraded my copy, but I kept the original. So this was the collection 30 years ago. This is what the collection looks like today, roughly. Journey of 1,000 miles, et cetera, et cetera. When I started buying SquareSoft's SNES RPGs back in the day, Breath of Fire, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Evermore, I pointedly, I never traded them in. I never traded, broke as I was a teenager, I was I did not ever sell them because it was I wanted to build this library of SquareSoft RPGs. That brand meant a lot to me. It had this very specific meaning of if you saw that on a game box, that was a quality role-playing game. So when I moved to Japan in the year 2000, I set myself a goal, sort of the first collecting goal I ever set for myself, which was I want to get everything that Square did on the Super Famicom. Because those, so many of those did not come to the US. Those were the games I really wanted because they were just very highly desired at that time by people who weren't living in Japan. I want to have the romancing sagas and stuff like that. We couldn't get a hold of those. And I expected going to Japan that they, like in the US, would be sort of pricey, kind of expensive, hard to get one's hands on. But it turns out you can actually buy complete copies of most of those games for like a couple of dollars each, like 100 yen, 500 yen. It turns out that the games that SquareSoft did in Japan, I mean, they were some of the biggest selling games, period, on the Super Famicom hard. Like Final Fantasy VI was like the Madden 95 of Japan. Now there are some games represented on, in this photograph, this series of photographs that are actually pretty rare. A lot of these are, and we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about these today, but Japanese personal computer game releases. Because PC games, upper left-hand corner up there, that's where Square got its start, making games on Japanese personal computer formats, not on consoles. And these PC formats were generally unavailable outside of Japan. It wasn't like IBM, it wasn't Apple, things like that. It was like Japan-specific formats, like the PC-8801 or the Sharp X1, things like that. And so these games, for the most part, just stayed inside Japan, and even today they're very rarely discussed. Like one of the problems with people discussing Japanese game history in English or outside of Japan is that what ends up happening is it's like, oh yeah, well, did you know that Square made Rad Racer? It's like, yeah, Square made Rad Racer, but that's kind of where it stops, because like Rad Racer came out in the US. And so that's the only point of reference that people have. But it's like, yeah, they made Rad Racer, but they made dozens of other games, prior to Final Fantasy as well. And all of those games, you can chart the history. You can see, like, Final Fantasy didn't come out of nowhere. This incredibly influential game that really kind of like set them on their path didn't come out of nowhere. It grew from somewhere. And not just Square. So many companies. Enix, which eventually merged with Square to form Square Enix, Konami, Koei, these companies started in the Japanese PC world, and they were sort of the origins of some of the biggest franchises and the early sort of testing grounds of some of the most famous game designers. And when you consider how important Japanese games of that era became to like how gaming culture developed worldwide, then the importance of Japanese personal computer gaming history is not given nearly enough attention outside of Japan. So let's talk about some. Okay, so Square was founded in 1983 as a division of an electrical power line company. Literally a contracting company called Denyusha that hung electric power lines. The reason why is because the son of the guy who ran this company was like, Father, I do not want to go into the electrical power line company. I want to make video games. It's like, okay, sure, son, start a video game division. It's nothing to do with what we do, but do it, I guess. The only problem is, this guy, Masafumi Miyamoto was his name, no relation to the Miyamoto from Nintendo. He was not a video game developer, he was not a video game programmer, anything. He didn't know anything, but what he knew was that there was a business opportunity here. And this is what a lot of people kind of started catching on to in the early 80s in Japan, that from their perspective, you go down to the store, buy a cassette tape, which is how a lot of video games were distributed at that point, buy a cassette tape for $1, fill it, hire somebody to fill it with computer code, and then you can sell it to somebody for $100. And so all you had to do was find somebody who'd put the right stuff into that cassette tape, then you could make 100 times your money. And so that's what he set out to do. So the first thing they did was they opened up in the Yokohama, Japan area, they opened up a computer salon, which was basically like an internet cafe with no internet. It was like computers, and you could come in and, because computers, very expensive. Who likes computers? Young people. What don't they have? Money. So they can come in and use the computers in the computer salon for a small fee, essentially. So it was a stealth kind of thing where it's like, let's see who comes in here and creates interesting like computer games, and let's try to hire them or get them to make games for us. One of the first Square employees who eventually became the CEO of the company. That's how they found him. And meanwhile, at nearby Yokohama National University were two third-year students who were buddies who loved playing computer games. They loved playing Wizardry and Ultima together. And that was Hironobu Sakaguchi and Hiromichi Tanaka. Sakaguchi would become the creator of the Final Fantasy series. Tanaka ended up as like the producer of the Mana series and various other games within Square. They were like college friends. And they saw in a magazine, oh, we can apply for a part-time job at this company called Square. Let's do that. So it took them a while. Eventually, in October 1984, Square, this little division that was sort of like just paying little amounts of money to college students, essentially, made their first game. Now it was very interesting because, so we think of Square and Enix, it's like, yeah, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, chocolate and peanut butter. You know, they were actually very, very different types of companies. Enix, they started up, they didn't make games either, but they announced a contest, and they were just like, video game contest. You know, programmers submit your video games, and if they're good, we'll publish them. So that's where they found Yuji Horii, you know, who did Dragon Quest. That's where they found Nakamura, who founded Chunsoft, which is now Spike Chunsoft. And, you know, and they just like had people submit a game. Whereas Square was actually very different. They brought people in from different disciplines, and they like brought in, you know, graphics people and programmers and even like game planners essentially. And like their first game, The Death Trap, this had a staff. It had a staff of people who made it, whereas a lot of games were made by one person, and the art was really bad because like it was programmer art, and that's what they went with. So that's what kind of made Square unique. Its first game is The Death Trap. It's a graphical adventure game. So, you know, kind of like, I mean, you know, Mystery House, essentially. Roberta Williams had invented, essentially, the graphic adventure game with Mystery House. Took the text adventure and added static graphic screens that sort of showed you where you were at. That's the Death Trap. It didn't really do that well in the marketplace, kind of owing to the amateur nature of the programmers. This was something that Sakaguchi would say later. He's like, this game shipped on 3 floppy disks when it really should have shipped on 1, and it was just because they actually didn't do a very good job of like programming it. And it ended up costing, you know, nearly like $100. And so, I mean, compared to other floppy disk games in the market, it was very expensive. They kind of got it together the next year with Will, The Death Trap 2. It's a direct sequel to The Death Trap, but instead of a hard-boiled spy thriller, it was a sci-fi game, and starring Aisha, this android that you see on the screen here. She's blinking a lot. And just to let you know, what you are looking at right now is the secret to Will's success. It is entirely contained in this animation. Because it's an animation. Will, I mean, okay, first of all, it shipped on a single floppy disk. Great, they got that part down. Important. But also, they had hired a new programmer. And this programmer had written a routine that let them update these graphics multiple times a second. Japanese computers were really, really great at displaying these beautiful bitmapped images. Consoles could not do this, but the refresh on them was incredibly slow. Like Death Trap, remember those old PC games? Like with Death Trap, it was like you waited for the picture to load it in, it's like down the screen. That's not going on here because they figured out how to refresh many times a second. And now you could have Japanese PC adventure games with animation. And so they took the shopkeepers basically, you know, were running stores in Akihabara or whatever. They set this up in the window, and they had people crowded around the window going, holy crap, she's blinking. There's animation. And this sold over 100,000 copies, like on the strength of this alone. And Will is generally known as the first Japanese animated adventure game. And I put a question mark there because whenever I say something is the first anything, somebody always has to come in and say, you know, actually this was something something. So I'm just saying that's generally known as that. You know, keep it to yourself. We now, moving right along, so Square, we don't think of Square today, or Square Enix today, or even Square back in the day as like being a porter, being a port house, you know, porting other people's games. But in '85, they did this to just quickly get their library, you know, kind of beefed up in this way. Apparently the reason for this was Square at the time had sort of an imbalance of like, they had a lot of engineers but fewer game designers, whereas other companies had the game designers but they didn't have the porting staff essentially to port this stuff. And so Square actually ported and published Dragon Slayer. That's the first game in Falcom's very famous series that eventually led to things like The Legend of Heroes or Trails in the Sky, those games. So Square ended up doing the PC 98 and the MSX versions of Dragon Slayer, and they ported it and they published it in their own packaging. They also did Thexter, the shooter game, which maybe you actually know because this did get released on US computer platforms, ported there by Sierra. And Square did the version for Sharp's X1 computer, and then Square also did a version of Thexter for the Famicom, or the NES, which we'll get to in a bit. This is all 1985. They're getting up to a lot in 1985. Before Square closed out 1985, it released its first RPG. It's called Genesis Beyond the Revelation. In October, this was headed up by Hiromichi Tanaka. Now, what's interesting about Genesis, and about the question really of Square's first RPG, what was Square's first RPG, is that if you look at different sources, many sources online, English language sources, Japanese language sources, will say that this game was released not in 85, but in 1987. And a lot of that is because like the history of Japanese computer games and the dates and all that kind of stuff, it is not nearly as well researched and documented as console gaming. And that's the same with US PC games versus console games as well. In fact, if you go to Wikipedia right now, this game is listed with a June 1987 release date, and that is the wrong month and a totally wrong year. And had this been released in June 87, it wouldn't have been Square's first RPG, not by a mile. But it was released in October 85. And the reason why that's wrong, by the way, is, here's the thing. If you go looking for this game, you're not going to find, a lot of scans of the box, the manual, and stuff like that. You're going to find the ROM. It's called ROM, it's a floppy disk image, everyone calls it the ROM. You're going to find the game itself, in an image file. And if you load up the PC 88 version, which is the most common platform, it's the most common version of the game, it says copyright 1985, 1987. So everybody's like, oh, it must be 87. Turns out, come to find out, that the PC 88 version says that because that version did come out in 87. It came out much later. But this game originally was only released on PC 98. And if you get the PC 98 version, it only says 85. And we only figured this out, by the way, because I don't know if you know Gaming Alexandria. It's this website that's doing a lot of they preserve stuff, boxes, manuals, games, and also they've been scanning a lot of magazines. So Dustin Hubbard over at Gaming Alexandria has been acquiring, and in fact, if you know about the Video Game History Foundation, the Video Game History Foundation does the retro magazine Blind Box, where you can subscribe to get a different classic video game magazine delivered to your house every month for $20 a month, and it's a big fundraiser that then funds the acquisition of other, unscanned, undocumented gaming media, such as Japanese computer magazines, which are by and large unscanned. The Game Preservation Society that's out in Tokyo has a library of them, but you can go to jail for scanning stuff in Japan. The scans aren't out there. So Gaming Alexandria starts scanning full year sets of Login, Japanese PC game magazine. And as part of the research for this book, he and I were kind of just going through just issue by issue by issue, page by page, and we're able to figure out when these things actually come out and get this data for the first time. And so you can even see, so Genesis here, Square's first RPG, designed by Hiromichi Tanaka, and it's only English on this screenshot. These guys were really inspired by Ultima in particular. This looks just like Ultima 4, basically. And wizardry and stuff like that. And at the time, a lot of Japanese players just played games in English. So in this case, all the commands were in English. All the dialogue and stuff like that is in Japanese, so it makes it difficult to play. But so was the first RPG, was it Hiromichi Tanaka's first game? I thought so, and it's not. Because one of the other things I wanted to really dig into with this book was, beyond every Square game that was released, I wanted to catalog the unreleased ones, what got canceled. Because sometimes, as you know, canceled or unreleased games, they turn up. And there was a game that was listed on a lot of lists of canceled Japanese PC 88 games. and it was called 3156 Koro Koro. And up until quite recently, again, even the pros, even the people in Japan, the Game Preservation Society, if you asked, they would have said, oh, that game is a canceled game, it never came out, we don't know anything about it. Turns out, in the October 1985 issue of Login magazine, it was published. It was published as a type-in program. And so, there's, up there in the center there, that's Hironobu, that's a mustache list, if you know what he looks like now. Hironobu Sakaguchi on the left, and Tanaka on the right, they're like 23. Genesis, which had just come out, is shown in those pictures there, and then down there is 3156 Koro Koro. And what you had to do to play this game was about rolling a little die around, and the joke, by the way, is that 3156 in Japanese can be pronounced Sai Koro, and that is how you say a die, a pair of dice. It's this super bad title, and Square never made another game with a bad title again. And so to play this game, you had to type in about 17 pages of hex code. It's not even basic where it like makes sense, it's just letters and numbers. Thankfully, Dustin Hubbard at Gaming Alexandria was able to OCR all of this and turn it into a tape file that we were able to play on emulators. And just a couple of months ago, for the very first time, people were able to play this game. I'm not going to toot my own horn too much in this panel, but I just want to point out, like because I was researching this book on Square, we found a lost Square game that everybody thought was gone and brought it back. And we got it running, and it's weird, you have to roll the dice around, but if there's a space that you can roll it to, you can't roll it if the die is going to hit its own number. I don't remember. But Sakaguchi tweeted about it, and that was cool. So, as I said, before 85 closed out, they really got up to a lot in 1985. Square released its first ever console game as a port of Dexter. This made sense. Famicom, not a great platform for like Ultima-style RPGs or graphic text adventures, but pretty good for like porting an action game that you have the rights to. This, unfortunately, is not actually really considered a very good version of Dexter. There we go. It was ported by a developer called Bits Laboratory, which was like an outsourcing type house. So Square wasn't even really involved from the development side. And then after this, they didn't put out any Famicom games for 9 months, which is like an eternity. As its rivals were just cranking out Famicom games. And the reason why is because Square's in-house designers were like, that's a toy for like children. Like we make serious adult content, literary content for adults on the computer, which is for adults. And that is a children's toy. And they really didn't want to do it. So they were still very much into making PC games. And they had developed a reputation at this point as being an animation powerhouse because they still had this proprietary code. And so, okay, so Square's great at making computer animation. Where do they go next? Well, what they did was very smart, very natural fit. They teamed up with Nippon Sunrise. This was the animation studio, the TV animation studio that had created Gundam. And together, they made a Gundam-style, mecha-based RPG where the battle scenes actually featured animation that was created by Sunrise. So it's like they and now just like instead of just a woman blinking, they can have actual professional quality animation with like correct movements and motion and stuff like that. It looks really good. And again, kind of gets to that idea of like Square was about collaboration. It was about the team making something and putting in what you can. Blasty, again, by the standards of the time, was a very big hit. This is like the easiest game to find now if you go to Yahoo auctions or whatever, so they sold tons of them. But this very early idea of this like collaboration between a game studio and an animation studio and like creating something that neither could have done on their own, it's very forward-looking considering it's like the spring of 1986. The other really interesting thing about Blasty is the packaging. This was one of the earliest, like, quote-unquote special editions, video game packages. I think they really kind of felt this was going to be a big hit because they were a little spendier in terms of what they put in the box. even the floppy disk, like this, the floppy here, that wasn't just a standard off-the-shelf floppy disk. They printed the Blasty like on the floppy plastic itself. It's a custom disk. The sleeve is custom. There's an art book in full color. There's a big old sticker, that yellow sticker on the side. And there's a flexi disc vinyl record with an arranged version of the theme music. That's the red thing there. And that was, the music was co-written by Nobuo Uematsu, who would do the Final Fantasy series. And so that's like the first piece of recorded, music in a sound format, by Uematsu was in this package. If you're a Final Fantasy XIV player, you might know about Cruise Chaser Blasty because they put that into the content of Final Fantasy XIV. It was a big hit in Japan. Blasty was headed up by Sakaguchi, and then Tanaka took the development of a game called Alpha. This was the first, this was the last, not the first, this is the last graphic adventure game that Square did for PCs. You can see the animation has leveled up considerably. She's not just blinking her eyes, but her eyes go back and forth, her mouth changes, lots of stuff going on. There's stuff going on in the background, like many different combinations just to make it look more alive and vivid. This is a third-person game because your character, your main character, Chris, there is she's always on screen essentially during the action, and at various points during the game, she is captured by enemy forces and like put in handcuffs while fully nude. This is a brief excursion into not quite like erotic game territory, but definitely sort of making the standpoint that like this is for like adults. By the end of '86, it became pretty clear Square needed to get on the Famicom. People were making way too much money. Computer game sales were going down. So for their next big game, King's Knight, they did a version for the MSX computer as well as the Famicom. But this was a Famicom, standard Famicom cartridge. This wasn't the big push though. The big push was, okay, Nintendo had released the Famicom disk system by this point, and Square saw the disk system peripheral as like, this is our way into the business. This was an add-on for the Famicom, for the NES in Japan, that let users play games not from standard cartridges, but from magnetic floppy disks. The advantages were many. Price. A game on a floppy disk was about half the price of a cartridge game. Rewritability. You could take the floppy disk and bring it to the store and have a different game written onto it once you were done. So if you bought a crappy game, you don't like it, great, take it back to the store, and for $5, the guy at the store would write Legend of Zelda onto the disc for you. And considering, again, like, you could get a game rewritten for about $5, that's like 1/10 of the price of what like a brand new cartridge game would go for. So it was very enticing. And additionally, and probably pretty big for Square, who was making like adventure games, stuff like that, the disk system would let you save and load your game data, without need for, say, putting a battery on the cartridge or something like that, which actually didn't even really exist yet for the Famicom at that time, because this is '86. The disk system appealed to Square as a maker of computer games. So kind of what you're looking at here are bits that are from an ad that they actually ran not in like a video game magazine, but in a computer magazine, saying like, hey, so Square did this thing called the Disc Original Group. So this was sort of the big plan. Not just Square, but these companies on the bottom right here, they kind of got all their buddies from the computer game world together and said, okay, we have a Famicom license. We can publish Famicom games. You guys make your styles of games for the Famicom, and we'll kind of introduce the Famicom world to these games that are made by Japanese computer makers. So that was sort of used like as a sales tactic here. The games up here, I kind of want to call out some of these games up here. So game number 1, the Crystal Dragon. This was actually this was them trying to do a graphic adventure in the style of Alpha or the Death Trap and do it on the Famicom. You couldn't use a keyboard to type in commands, So it was a point-and-click adventure game. They actually did a very early point-and-click adventure game. So there were icons on the top of the screen for like, an eyeball for look, that sort of thing. Number 2 is Deep Dungeon. This was the first 3D dungeon crawling, wizardry style, sort of perspectival RPG on the Famicom, so my Hummingbird soft. Number 3, also really interesting. You can see it says Activision up there. It's called Appletown Monogatari Little Computer People. Little Computer People was the name of an Activision game for computers, released in the US. And the conceit was, it was like a virtual pet, except for it was a little tiny human being, like in their house, and you can sort of like interact with them, like not directly control it, like kind of like Seaman or something like that, right? And then they brought it to Japan and on the Famicom, and sort of again replaces the character with a cute little girl, right? And did essentially the Japanese version of that. Number four is very interesting. We're going to get to that in a bit. It's called Tobidase Daisakusen. We'll talk about it in a little bit. And then number 5, that if you know those characters, those read Seiken Densetsu. And it was Seiken Densetsu, The Emergence of Excalibur. And that was pitched as, this was going to be like volume 1 of a 5-disc massive RPG. And it got canceled because it got too complicated, development got too complicated. And when that got canceled, people had pre-ordered it. Like this was supposed to come out like soon at this point. And they basically told people who had pre-ordered it, like, oh hey, we're actually canceling this game, but you want to shift your pre-order to this new game we're doing called Final Fantasy. And so they probably got something a lot better out of the bargain, basically. So let's move on a little bit here to Nasser Gabelli. So Nasser Gabelli, he was a superstar Apple II game designer. He's Iranian-American, lived in California. He had made a lot of big hit Apple II games. And in 1985, he was kind of looking for the next thing. And a mutual industry contact, it was Doug Carlston, head of Broderbund, introduces Gabelli to Masafumi Miyamoto, who is still CEO of Square. And Miyamoto brings Gabelli on, flies him to Tokyo, and brings him on to Square on a royalty contract type basis to start programming games. Nasser Gabelli ended up getting rich because, again, like everybody else was working on like pretty low salaries, which is the norm in Japanese gaming industry, and like this dude was getting royalties of every Final Fantasy game they sold. He got all the way up. He programmed Secret of Mana, and by that point had made so much money that he stopped working. And he has not worked since. He literally travels the world. I don't know if he consults or what, but my understanding is literally just like made total crazy money. So his first game with Square was very interesting. So you might recognize the 3D Battles of World Runner, which came out on NES. So Gabelli, interestingly enough, I find out he called it Jumpin' Jack, Jump-N-Jack. And if you load up the Japanese version of this, and you watch on the bottom where it says World 1-3, and you sort of watch the opening crawl, it still says that in there. It actually says Jumpin' Jack. But Square called it Tobidase Daisakusen, jump out, the big mission sort of thing. And then this ends up, so it was a platform game, right? But you ran into the screen. It was a 3D platform where the world scrolled towards you, kind of like Space Harrier. And it was really impressive, programming-wise, that he had done this. And this caught the eye of a guy named Greg Fishbach, who he was a game industry executive, and he and some other former Activision guys kind of gotten together, and they founded the company Acclaim. And it was specifically, they founded Acclaim to make games for the NES, but they didn't make marketing guys. So, and people in the US weren't making NES games. So Greg Fishbach went to Tokyo, went to Akihabara, and just shopped around and sees this game, and it's like, oh, that's cool, and so they ended up licensing this and releasing it as the 3D Battles of World Runner. And that was the first Square game to ever come to the US. And then, of course, yes, Cabelli's next game was originally announced in the ad on the previous slide as Tobi-Dase Racing. And then it eventually became called Highway Star, which then gets released as Rad Racer. And Nintendo released that in the US, they sold a ton of them. So Square, rapidly moving away from computer games. It was so funny, it was so like resistant to the idea of going into the Famicom, then when it did, it just went all in. Its final computer game was, again, really interesting, very unexpected. It was Alien 2. It was based on the movie Aliens, the James Cameron movie, yeah. Right, no, yes. Yes, yeah, okay, yeah, thanks, yeah. I improvised that line and then I'm like, wait a goddamn minute. All right. I'm very tired. Originally, so Square was like, we're going to make versions of Aliens for the MSX, the PC-88, the X1, and the Famicom Disk System. Only one that came out was the MSX. And again, thank you, Dustin Hubbard of Gaming Alexandria, wherever you are, for scanning those old Japanese PC game magazines, because some of the sprites on the bottom here are from the unreleased, like that guy getting his stomach burst open in the lower left-hand corner. It's from the unreleased PC-88 version, has not been seen for 30 years. Like Rad Racer and like World Runner, like these Alien games were being worked on by like people who would eventually be like Final Fantasy Superstars, music by Uematsu, graphics by Takashi Tokita, who ended up being like the story writer of Final Fantasy IV. But they're still kind of like flailing and kind of trying to figure out what it is they're doing. But what I hope that you can see, what I hope the takeaway is from all the stuff I've been talking about, is that when you start thinking about like, what are the strengths of Final Fantasy? When you start thinking about what makes SquareSoft, that if you can see the development of all these different philosophies happening, like the cinematic nature of the death trap and the animation of will, the love of Western role-playing games is reflected in games like Genesis, the push towards the feature film quality animation and Blasty, the desire to kind of put these high-end PC-style, experiences on the console, the combining of the adventure and the RPG mechanics and the disk system games. This is actually really interesting. This was done internally at Square. It's Cleopatra no Maho, and it is a combination at like graphical adventure game RPG. So you start playing, it's like a graphical adventure game, and then you get into a random battle with somebody. It's really weird. And then, and this is all like the road to Final Fantasy. This is how everything came together to create this magnum opus. It wasn't just like trying to fast follow Dragon Quest. It didn't come out of nowhere. But it's to understand it, so you have to understand this stuff that's not often talked about that came before it. Disk system was very popular in 1986, very popular in 87, quickly became obsolete because the advantages of it disappeared. The cost of ROM cartridges came down. ROM cartridges got bigger. The battery technology could save your game. Very quickly, there was like no reason to own a disk system. Square had like 2 more disk system projects in the works, and these are really interesting because they released these in the least risky way possible, which was they were exclusive to the disk writer, the kiosk in the stores that you would go into to get a new game written. These games were only available through that. There was no packaged version. What's really interesting about this is what it means from a collector's perspective. Because a lot of games, if they don't sell well, the games are still probably out there somewhere, But for disk system, disk writer exclusives, there is no like, oh, I have back stock of this. There is no warehouse find. There's no, I found a box of these somewhere. There was no clearance sales. There's no bargain bin. For one of these games to have been created, each game was created to order for somebody who went and bought it at full price. And if nobody bought it, it didn't exist. So they're pretty hard to find, especially with when you got one, you were given like a single sheet black and white manual that came along with it. And those are pretty hard to find as well. This is something that I'm going to go into in this book, like, not just, again, just sort of talking about the game sort of floating out there in space, but like, what constitutes a complete copy? How do you find this stuff? How rare is this stuff? in 1989, Square opened up shop for itself in the United States, actually right next to Nintendo's headquarters in Redmond, Washington. And they introduced themselves to the US with ads like what you see above. They noted, hey, Rad Racer sold 1 million copies around the world because of Nintendo. And they actually had their first, Square's first million-selling game that they published themselves was the Final Fantasy Legend for Game Boy. Was the first Saga game in Japan. That sold 1 million copies because instead of being late to the Game Boy, they were really early to the Game Boy. And in fact, Saga was one of the first 20 games released for the Game Boy in Japan. And they sold a ton of those. With RPG on the Game Boy was really crazy. The fact that they had sold 1 million copies of Saga in Japan turned out to not actually be an indicator of how that game would perform in the US, or even really, it's Square's future games in the US as well. This is really interesting. It's hard to see, this is something that ran in like a retailer publication. It's a US Game Boy game, it says The Great Warrior Saga. This shows that Square was originally going to release the Saga series under its own branding in the US, but they changed it to the Final Fantasy Legend so as to sort of capitalize on the fact that like Nintendo was making a big deal releasing the first Final Fantasy. Somewhere out there, I think, is a color version of this. It's waiting to be discovered in some library somewhere. I'd love to see that. I have 27 seconds left. Okay, Square. They didn't release any of the Final Fantasy mainline games in Europe until Final Fantasy VII, but they did take Final Fantasy Adventure, or Seiken Densetsu, the first Seiken Densetsu, released it as Mystic Quest. Then they released Final Fantasy Mystic Quest as Mystic Quest Legend, leading Europeans to believe that there was something called the Mystic Quest series, which didn't exist. This is a funny thing that I made. Because originally, this game, released in Secret of Mana, was going to be called Final Fantasy IV. And then they were like, no, that's not Final Fantasy enough. Let's call it Chrono Trigger. And then that didn't happen either because that was going to be a CD-ROM game. This I made up, this is fake. But if you ever wondered why this cast of Secret of Mana looks like the cast of Chrono Trigger, it's because it actually, like, this was originally almost going to be Chrono Trigger, skipping over everything. And finally, the Satellaview, this is really fascinating because Square, you downloaded games, not even downloaded, you got them through satellite TV broadcasts in Japan on Super Famicom. Radical Dreamers, just released in the Chrono Cross special edition that they did, text adventure sequel to Chrono Cross. There are other games too, like these full games that were made. And so this is also really fascinating. I'm going to talk about it all in the book. Hi, anyway. The panel's over, the show's not over. Collector's Guide to SquareSoft, coming from Press Run, 1996 is what is covered. Should be out before we see each other again in Portland next year. I have to go back to my booth. If you want, come say hello to me at the booth, number 300 on the show floor. We got 2 more hours of the show, and I'll see you there. Bye, thank you.
Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and to the right are the playlist of the Portland Retro 2022 and some other interesting videos. Thank you.